But it's not my fault. I don't understand why I'm losing the earnest money. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors and director of the Georgia Real Estate Academy. Today's contract tip has to do with the difference between fault and default. So just a quick contract tip for everybody. There is a possibility in our GAR, Georgia Association of REALTORS, and in the RE forms contracts where a party might be at default of the contract, even though it is not their fault in how they think about not having control over the situation. So what do you mean, Dana? What are you talking about? Well, just as a brief example, in the GAR purchase and sale contract package, for example, let's look at the financing contingency exhibits. In those financing contingency exhibits, the seller basically gives the buyer so many days from binding agreement date to convince a lender to lend them the money. And if they are not able to do that, then a buyer must send notice of termination to the seller, and they must prove it with a loan denial letter. However, the reason that the lender puts on that loan denial letter, there are very specific reasons outlined in the GAR loan contingency exhibit where it states what may not be on that loan denial letter. Well, let me take that back. If a lender puts the sole reason as one of these outlined in this GAR exhibit as the reason for the loan denial, it does not meet the terms of that contingency, meaning the buyer in this example would be in default. So for example, in the GAR, I'm on paragraph 8 in, for example, the GAR conventional loan contingency exhibit, and it states, notwithstanding any provision to the contrary contained herein, the loan denial letter may not be based solely upon one or more of the following. A, buyer lacking sufficient funds other than the amount of the loan to close. Well, that would be a buyer's fault as well as a default if that was the sole reason for the loan denial on the loan denial letter. While I'm here, parenthetically, you agents working with buyers who are getting down payment assistance funds, you need to make sure that you make the contract contingent upon them getting those funds. If they're getting down payment assistance funds and they don't get funds, in and of itself, they will not meet the terms of the financing contingency, meaning it's not their fault that, for example, a Georgia Dream program or any other program didn't give them the funds necessarily, but that default, and they would lose their earnest money as well. Here's another one. Buyer not having leased or sold real property. That without making the deal contingent upon that. Buyer not having provided lender in a timely manner with all the information required by the lender. So that one probably would be a fault of the buyer as well as a default. Buyer making purchases that adversely affect the buyer's debt to income ratio. Yep, that one probably would fall under fault as well as default. Property not appraising for at least purchase price subject to an appraisal contingency, and there's a whole separate appraisal contingency. Not necessarily the buyer's fault, but potentially default. Lender not having completed underwriting the loan request in time. That one, not necessarily the buyer's fault, but would constitute a default by not meeting, if that's the sole reason on the loan denial letter, that would constitute buyer's default and they would lose their earnest money. For example, not getting that loan denial letter in time to send to the GAR contract package. You have 7 days after sending notice of termination. In the RE forms contract package, you must send that loan denial letter simultaneously with the notice of termination. What's another example? Another example could be seller was, for example, a gap in the chain on title. So let's say the seller bought the property during the foreclosure years. And when they purchased it, that closing attorney did not do the full 50-year title look back, and they were not able to, and now that buyer who bought it back then is selling it, and now there is a gap in that chain of title. Well, the current title company, the current closing attorney, can't solve that gap. They have to breach that gap in the chain of title. So they have to reach out to the closing attorney that closed it when this seller bought it, and lo and behold, that closing attorney is no longer in business. So it is going to take time, and the seller is not able to clear up that title, and therefore not able to convey good and marketable title due to this gap in this chain by the closing date. So that might constitute a default by the seller, but not necessarily the seller's fault. So there are myriad examples in the contract where a party not necessarily fulfilling their obligation may constitute a default, even though it is not their fault. Now, default and breach of contract, the remedies for those might be two separate things. It depends on the nature of the breach. Is it a material breach? Is it a minor breach? That's the topic of a whole nother video. Point of practice to you agents. You need to make sure that your clients and customers are in consistent, ongoing communication with the other parties involved in a real estate transaction. For example, the lender. So why does the contract consider some of those issues a buyer default, even though it's not their fault? Well, the buyer chose that lender, and there are a number of lenders that a buyer can use to help them get their loan or not get their loan to purchase a home. So you need to make sure to encourage your public people to stay in ongoing, consistent communication with all of the parties involved in consummating this transaction and doing what they need to do to get everything closed. Lenders, closing attorneys, title companies, insurance agents, independent home inspectors, roofing companies, structural engineers, there's just a variety, surveyors, there is a variety of other people that are involved in helping a buyer and a seller contract for a property to convey and have a successful closing. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors and director of the Real Estate Academy of Georgia, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.